We're going to do an overview of the model, and first I'm going to give a high-level breakdown, and then we're actually going to look at a pretty large model that we can start to see this in action. So if I were to think of the file itself, I want to organize it pretty consistently. So I'm going to keep my libraries and dependencies at the top, and then afterwards I'm going to define my relationships and associations. So has many, belongs to, actually in the reverse order. So belongs to first and then has many next. One way that I would think about the model is kind of like the birth certificate of an object. So much like your birth certificate, right? Your parents are spelled out first, and then down the road you may already have siblings, or you will have them in the future, and so those would come second. So capturing belongs to first, has many second. If that really doesn't sit well with you, the other example that I would give is belongs to would actually have an attribute that lives on this object, and so we would prioritize that. Whereas has many is used by active record, and so the other object is actually going to store the value. So after we do relationships and associations, we are going to move on to defining the object itself, right? So the attributes that pertain to it. First, we would define what they are. So if you have like enums and that kind of stuff, it would be first, and then we would do validation. So validate presence, validate uniqueness, validate format. All of that would go after you declare your enums. From there, we would move into clarifying key occurrences, scopes, and we would start to spell out. This is less about defining the object itself and more about how it would be used or frequently queried collections of that object. Then we would go into callbacks. There's a specific order for callbacks, so we're not going to get too granular there in terms of before save, after save. Ideally, we would organize it by when it's called in the processing, but just knowing that callbacks go together is pretty important. And then we move into the rest of the document, which tends to be where most of the logic lives. We would put individual methods first, then the methods that are enacted upon collections. So those would start with self. So if it's self dot anything, it would go farther in the document, and then we would move down to private methods. One thing that we like to use and keep pretty consistent throughout our applications is private methods, whether actually in the controller or the model, would actually start with an underscore. So if I was going to give a quick example of an individual method, I would do something like is active, right? And usually we're going to start Boolean values, things that are true or false, with is. So return true, and then on a collection, and then I would spell out some logic here around a collection of active things, of active objects. This one here would likely live as a scope, but you can see this is they would live in this order, right? So the methods performed on a collection would live after those on just an individual object. And then underneath, when we actually define a private method, we start with an underscore. So ensure user is admin, right? We are going to start with an underscore. Why we do this is because models can get really long, and so if as you're reading through something and you can see, oh, that starts with an underscore, you immediately know that its usage is confined to the current file that you're in, or any ones that are nested under it. And so you're not going to try and call this in a view or in some other place because it is isolated here. So really simple visual cue that kind of complements effective naming really well. So let's go actually dive into where this presents in a model. So I've got this campaign model that's actually used for a fundraising system, and so we're not going to get too much into where this comes from, but you can see here we're spelling out a lot of our concerns. Most of these we've written ourselves, but then also here friendly ID, which is a gem. We have to include that here so that we can build out a really pretty slug URL for this object when it's viewed in the browser. And then we're going to get down here into the association. So again, starting with belongs to, put them all nice and neatly together, has many, moving on down the list. In terms of what order these go in, I try and keep like things together, but by and large, it doesn't get so big that it's overwhelming, especially if you do a nice job of putting a single line break in between each of these. And then we are going to do things like mount the uploader and have an enum with active storage. It's going to look a little bit different. This application is using carrier wave, but active storage will again define the images that live on this object. And then we're going to kind of skip over attribute accessor here just because that's a unique instance and outside the purview of this presentation. But next, you can see we have some validation. So we're validating the name of a campaign, the financial goal in dollars. Then we move into scopes, and then our callbacks, right? All callbacks here start with an underscore because they are only used in this specific document. As we get down into actual methods, right, try to keep it pretty clear, concise, and you'll notice none of them are called on a collection. They would all be called on an individual object. And then as we get further down, you can see all the ones that start with self, which would pull from a collection. Those are all grouped together at the bottom right before you get to private methods. And then you can see again, all starting with underscores listed below. And there you have it, a pretty quick overview of organizing the model.